Good morning, everyone. I'm Monica Isaza for those that don't know me. Greetings from Rome. I'm going to be discussing chapters 7 and 8, which speak about what things regulate cyberspace and the limits of open code. The author makes a strong point about the responsibility that we need to have as users and as citizens in the creation of these new regulations to cyberspace. In order to control certain behaviors and to protect our liberties as a society, since this whole environment is new and we still don't know what the consequences of these regulations will be upon our liberties. So going back to the first point about what kind of things regulate cyberspace, the author starts chapter 7 describing libertarian theory that was created by John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill believed that the government is a threat to liberty and that private action is not. He then poses an important question asking, what is a threat to liberty and how can we resist it? He gives an example about this in 19th century England. The government imposed some norms against free speech, and this was a violation of liberty, and so people had to create some regulations and rebel against the government to improve this. Fast forwarding to modern times, he gives the example how cyberspace has become this new threat to our liberty, and therefore we need to regulate it, and we need to do so very carefully and become educated about how we're doing this. So he explains that the way that we regulate cyberspace is through code, as we started learning in the previous chapters. And he believes that in order to be able to regulate cyberspace in a fair manner, we need to understand how the regulations work and how the government can influence those regulations. So he then goes on to explain what kind of things can regulate something, and he makes an analogy to a dot being pressed by 4 different constraints, and he described this as number 1, legal, or the laws, 2 is the market, 3 is technology, and also the architecture, and 4 is social norms. This is how he argues that real life is regulated. He makes this introduction because he later on parallels this to how cyberspace is regulated also by these same things. So he believes that each of these 4 constraints has different costs for engaging citizens and users of the internet and influencing them on what the regulator wants to do. So for instance, the government can create laws to influence behavior, or it can influence the market to change the behavior also of citizens. It can use the architecture to alter this behavior, and it can also use social norms. He then explains that regulators want to always impose constraints in a way which benefits them, and so he says that how these constraints and these regulations are carried out need not only to serve the purpose for the regulator, because sometimes their purpose can be unjust, and this can also be conflicting with laws, our values, and social norms in our society. He strongly believes that regulation should be transparent, in real life and also in cyberspace, and he discusses this more in depth in the following chapter, which I will discuss a little bit later. So he continues on to explain that the law functions in two ways. It can influence people directly. It can threaten people with punishment if they don't do or follow the norms that the law wants them to follow, or it can punish them or influence them indirectly. So this means that the government can modify the structures of a constraint without being transparent, and it can get people to do something using one of the constraints, either the market or the laws, etc. He makes an example here of the government trying to reduce the incidence of abortion. And he explains how the government started asking doctors to counsel their patients that abortion was not a choice for birth control. So as patients, when a doctor tells us something, most of us, we fully believe them. And they just thought that this is what the doctor recommended, and they never knew that it was actually a policy that the government was trying to achieve, but they weren't being transparent about it. They weren't saying it themselves directly, but they were using doctors to pass on the message. So in this way, they misdirect their responsibility. They're not accountable for it, and they're making someone else accountable. Thus, he drives an important point that I agree with very much, in which he says that, again, we need to become educated on how these norms and regulations are created, especially because we still don't know what kind of impact they can have in our lives later on. We need to be aware of the dangers of different methods of regulation and regulating, because they can challenge our constitutional values and rights. The same way, he believes that we need to regulate cyberspace. So he believes that policies and laws need to be transparent, and so do the regulations of code need to be transparent. And like in real life, we have the right to know the agenda under which regulations are being created. He believes that also in cyberspace, we also have the right to know the agenda, and we must understand how these regulations and how this code is created so we can be aware of what's happening, and so that code is not being influenced in a way that we can't understand, and we just assume it to be a natural thing, and we don't see actually what's really happening. He believes that the government can regulate code writing, and it can also do so directly or indirectly by influencing, for example, the market to create certain kind of code, or it can also influence it indirectly using some kind of constraint to influence the way this code is being created. So he believes that we need to worry about regimes that make it easier and invisible to regulate, and we need to be very wary of this. Without transparency, we cannot resist bad regulations. And he believes that because these are all new developments, we still need to figure out how this will infringe our rights, and we need to be very aware and really become educated and educate younger generations so that we're not tricked in a way. The state, he believes, has no right to hide its agenda, And so he believes that code and the creators of code also need to have an open agenda about it is being created. So going on to the second point about the limits in open code, the author drives the same point that we spoke about in the last discussion, in which he believes that we expect an increase in regulations and regulability of cyberspace. He believes that changing the architecture of the net will enable government more control because our behavior will be able to be more traceable and controllable. Then he believes that code can intervene with our ordinary democratic process, and we need to be able to hold code regulators accountable just how we're able to hold real-life policy creators accountable. One huge point in Chapter 8 that he speaks about is transparency. He has a key criticism of the government and of the creation of code regarding transparency, because there has been a lot of instances in which programs or different activities are going on in the net in closed code, and we as users are not able to have access to this, especially if we're not technologically savvy. Code is influencing our behavior, but we're not being aware that it's doing so because it's being done in a closed way. And he believes that this can weaken democratic practices in our society. So if code is going to be the regulator of our cyberspace, the kind of code that does so is very important, and as I said many times already, is very important for us to be aware about it. He then argues that there's two kinds of code, one that is open and transparent, and one that is closed and it's more opaque. He then speaks for a bit about open code and about, for example, the free software movement that Richard Stallman created, which is some kind of open source software movement where the creators and the community of code creators believe that people have the right to know and access the code whenever they want, that this should not be some kind of secret, that we should all be able to collaborate and co-create it as we go. So he then says that the more that we know about this open code, the more power that we have as consumers and as citizens to put constraints on state power and to direct the way in which they control us. So he believes that code constrains the power of government to regulate it, and he believes that code should be open. And then he closes that section saying that the kind of code that is deployed really matters. He then goes to explain how the law functions, and he describes that the law functions in two different ways. As I already mentioned, that it can be direct in a way that this tells people how to behave, and it threatens people with punishments if they don't follow the norms. And the law can also influence us indirectly. It can modify structures of constraint to achieve its goal. We need to be aware of the dangers these methods present, and we need to be aware of them because they can infringe on our freedom, in our rights, and in our social norms. He then explains the problem of indirection. He believes that being controlled indirectly or with indirection misdirects responsibility. and makes someone else responsible, and it undermines accountability. Um, uh, Consumers of misrepresentation don't even realize that they're being influenced in a certain way because they don't even know who is directly regulating them. So the author, and so do I, believe that the lack of transparency can cause many problems here as we start creating these new uh, regulations that are actually affecting us more and more, because more and more of our lives are becoming close to the net, and the net is such a part of our daily interactions and our daily interactions with people. And I think that this can be dangerous if government and code writers are making decisions for us that we as citizens and consumers are not being aware of. So there's one big point about transparency. He believes that the state has no right to hide its agenda, and neither do the code writers. He believes that if there is no transparency, it is difficult to resist bad regulations. Moving on to the following chapter, to the following section, he starts speaking about the history of the internet, and he goes a little bit into HTML, how it became the fastest growing computer language in the world, and how the openness of its nature, of its code, is what actually created the boom that it had. And actually, this boom is what created what we know now as the internet. He speaks about Linus Torvalds, which was the creator of GNV Linux, which is open source. And he explains a little bit about their culture in this community of code writers, which is a culture of being open. They are committed to keeping code free and open to users and to making everything public. Nobody needs to ask permission to change it or utilize it because it's just right there, accessible to everyone. He then argues that code can be regulated because code writers can be controlled by the government, and if the government wants to impose something, they might be scared of the punishment the government can impose on them if they don't follow what the government is asking. And when a target of regulation complies, because customers can do little bit to accept this. So in a way, if the community of code writers can be strongly influenced by the government, and if they comply with this, we as end users, as consumers, as citizens, we have no other way than to accept it because we won't even be aware that this is happening. One big point of this chapter is that to the extent that code is open, the power of government is constrained. Why is that? Because the more that we're educated, the more that we understand, the more that things are open and transparent, the more that we as citizens and consumers can make a choice and can decide whether or not we want to adopt a regulation, whether or not we want to use some kind of program. If we don't agree with the kind of code that is being written with, or something like this, then we can make a choice to not use it and to not make that a part of our life. He then goes on to argue if, for example, issues were transparent of government matters, then he then goes to argue about how in society issues that matter to consumers need to be transparent, and then he believes that, such as privacy, so then he believes that code should also be transparent. And then here he gives an example about voting machines and how this, when we had the George Bush election back in 2004, these machines were having a lot of trouble tallying up the votes, and then they figured out that the machines were created in closed code. And the owner had control of the machines, they had control of how they worked, and they were making promises to President Bush saying that they promised that they would win in Ohio and such. And this raised a big question in transparency, and obviously this is a problem because if we as users didn't know what was going on with the machines, they didn't want to disclose how they worked, then we have little choice on how to make an influence on this. So the author argues that since these matters of public concern are important, then we as consumers have the right to understand and to be able to access the code and to understand how these things are working, to avoid this kind of lack of transparency and to avoid this kind of violations of our rights. Finally, he asked the question of how does open code affect regulability? He believes that the more open the code is, the more that we can influence the way we're regulated, and the more that code can be a preventer of the government creating regulations that go against our freedoms. He believes that the government can make rules only if the people are willing to accept them and accept those restrictions, especially in a democracy. And open architecture and open code in the net becomes an important check of the regulating power of the government. So finally, to sum everything up, the author makes several points. Number one, it's whether a net can be regulated depends on its architecture. Some architectures are regulable, open, and others are not. An architecture that is more closed. Number two is that the government can manipulate and has a role in deciding whether the architecture can be regulated or not. If it decides to regulate this architecture, this code, it can do so directly or it can do so indirectly. Number three is that the government has the power to regulate code, and it depends somewhat on the character of the code. So he believes that open code is less regulable and that closed code is more regulable. The more open the code is, the less power the government has to influence this. Number four, the author strongly believes that the government must be constrained, and he endorses the constraints that open code imposes on the government. But he also believes that the government has a role in influencing these regulations, and that we must understand this power, and we must become educated in it. He also believes that we must understand our values, and we must understand how these values can be advanced also in cyberspace in the net. An open code changes the power of government to regulate. It serves kind of like a Freedom of Information Act, in which, as in the real world, laws are open, and he believes that open code requires transparency, and it needs to be public in order to promote a democratic society. And finally, he believes that the regulability of cyberspace and also of real life is conditional in the character of code. And as I already said, open code can reduce the power of government. So that's pretty much it. The question that I would want us to focus, and I would want you to help answer in our discussion, is how do you believe open code affects regulability? And I will leave you with a TED video which explains how open source works and how the presenter believes that open code will change the way the government functions. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.